Hey everybody, welcome back. Alright, so the focus of this lesson and the next lesson is to show how complexity in chord progressions comes out of simplicity. Before we get into it, I just want to go into this chord progression. So obviously this is the full chord progression that you'll have in the work files if you bought the course. I know you don't have this if you're following along on YouTube. Don't worry, that's not important. We're actually going to get into how to build this literally from scratch. I just want to show you basically what it looks like at the end so we all get a good idea of sort of where we're going with this. So as you can see, there's a lot going on here. It looks pretty complicated, and obviously it's based on your opinion whether you think it sounds good or not, but I like it. I'm just going to sort of play it quickly, or at least some of it. Let's say from here. So you get the idea. It evolves all over. This is like a 32 bar chord progression and it evolves along. But we're going to talk about how we get to that point just from starting with simple triads. All right. So you can then repeat that yourself with any melody you like from scratch. All right. So let's just get this out the way. And I'm just going to start with a simple 4 bar chord progression. And this is pretty much how I start all of my chord progressions. Not every single one. Some start a bit differently. I might start with like single notes and then add chords to that. But either way, this is usually how I start. So let's go in to our MIDI editor. And of course, our first chord is in C. So it's C minor. I've already shown in the last lesson how we go about actually making triads. And just for those who are new, I will actually just stick in these sort of ghost notes. They're not going to play anything. It's just that people can see which notes are in the G minor scale. And as I showed in the last lesson as well, so we got our first chord. We know the chord progression is going to start with our 1 chord and then our 4 bar chord progression. In this instance, I'm just going to pick the chord that it's going to end with because it's either a 4 or a 5 chord. And in this case, I'm going to use a 5 chord. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's G. There's the root note, B flat, and then D. And then the 2 chords in between. And then we will start with a 6 chord, which is A flat. And then a 3 chord, so that would be E flat, but we're going to go lower with it. So this is our sort of starting 4 bar chord progression. Except we'll have that last chord an octave lower, so I'm just highlighting it. In Cubase, you just hold the shift and down arrow keys to drop it an octave. So, basic, nice little chord progression, fine. But if I just said, look, here's my chord progression, you'd be forgiven for thinking that's overly simplistic. But as you'll start to see, we are going to add, using simple steps, layers of complexity to this. Just note, by the way, there is absolutely nothing wrong with using simple triads if that suits your song and what you want to achieve. We want to get something for this track that's perhaps could be described as a bit more emotionally complex. So we need to sort of build on just the simple triads. But for some songs, certainly pop songs and stuff like that, it can really work. Just using simple triads can be enough. All right, so the next step is to duplicate this over. So I'm going to make this into an 8 bar chord progression. So we'll certainly start the second repetition, if you like, or the second half of this 8 bar chord progression with the C minor chord. But we'll probably have a couple of different notes in between, and let's just mix this up a bit and we'll have a 4 chord for our last chord. So I'm just going to drag that down. And then, of course, I know what chords I want in between. I want this second chord in the second half to be a 5 chord, so I can just nick the one that we put in there. And then I want a 3 chord, which I can just steal from there as well and drag that over. So, of course, when I made it for the first time, it wasn't like this just suddenly happened and I just went, oh yeah, I want a 1 chord, a 3 chord, a 5 chord, or whatever. I obviously just played around with it. I did pick the 1 chord, I did pick the 5 chord to start off with as the last note in the first half of the progression. And then I messed around using different chords and found these two, which works really nicely. And then I did the same for the next one as well. So once I'd obviously have the 1 chord and the 4 chord, I then played around with these two and tried different chords out and just found these that worked quite well. Okay, so this is what we got so far, and it is super basic. So as it is so simplistic, let's have a look at how we can make this sort of emotionally deeper. So the first and simplest way is to use different voicings for the chords. So using different voicings simply means you're changing the octave that the notes are in, but you're actually using the same notes. So for example, if I take, say, the E flat of the first chord and then move that down an octave, kind of get a different feel, or up an octave, for example. You get a much more sort of epic sound, if you like. It's one way of describing it anyway. And you don't just have to move the notes to a different position, you can actually duplicate the notes. So the most common sort of thing that you could do is add a bass note. So let's copy the C down, and it just really thickens it up and gives it a much sort of deeper sound. So that's fine for the first chord. On the second chord, we'll duplicate the top note, but we'll have this an octave down. So this kind of effectively becomes the bass note of the chord. Now we'll do the opposite for the third chord. So, oops, sorry, didn't want to do that. Just duplicating up the E flat there. So already it's starting to sound a bit nicer, a bit sort of more emotional perhaps. That will sort of come together as we go, but let's just play around with this last chord now. And I want to do something a bit different on this one. Up to now, these 3 chords have just had sort of simple voicing changes or additions. So for this chord, let's work on that. So what I'm going to do is actually use what's called a 7th chord. Now, just be aware that those who are new to music theory, a 7th chord with a TH after it and a 7 chord without the TH are actually different things. The 7 chord relates to the position of the triads. So again, we go back to our numbers. It's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So a 7 chord would just be a chord starting with B flat and then making a simple triad. But a 7th chord is any triad that you add a 4th note to, which is a 7th interval above the root note. Now, that sounds really complicated, but it's actually dead simple. So I want to make a 7th chord out of this chord. All I do is literally follow along. So where we made the chord in the first place, we picked the root note, then we skipped a note in the scale, added a note, then we skipped another note in the scale and added another note. And now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to skip a note in the scale and add another note, which is F. Okay, and that is now a 7th chord. And you can sort of hear the emotional impact that has. It's much greater than just having the standard chord there. Not that it's bad or anything, but it just changes the feel of it. One last thing I want to do to this is actually I'm going to take that D and I'm going to move that down an octave just to sort of open up the chord a bit. So starting to sound very nice and certainly very different from just the original triads. Just a quick note here, if you are struggling to understand this, then you really should get our Music Theory for EDM Producers tutorial, also known as Killer Melodies, as it takes you from the absolute basics of scale all the way through in simple and repeatable steps to creating complex and original chord progressions and melodies. And we go into much more depth than we are here, really explaining each little bit so you can follow it step by step and make your own awesome chord progressions and melodies. So definitely check that out if you're finding this a bit tricky. Okay, so let's carry on with the second half of this 8-bar chord progression. So again, I'm going to duplicate the C from the first chord. And this one, I'm actually going to change the voicing of this. I'm going to move that up an octave. I'm going to duplicate up the B flat, and I'm going to duplicate the D down one octave. Let's just quickly play that so we can hear what we've got so far. Sorry, actually, before we go any further, I just want to explain this doesn't happen through simple knowledge of music theory. What I'm doing here is, well, when I made this the first time, is literally just experimenting with the different voicings, just trying different notes in different positions, trying a seventh chord, maybe trying a sus chord, which we'll talk about in a bit. Try a borrowed chord, which we'll also talk about in a bit. But we literally, it's just about experimentation. It's not like you get to the point where, at least for me anyway, certainly don't get to the point where I'm like, I've got a chord and I'm like, oh, the perfect chord after that will be this, and then the perfect chord after that will be this, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really happen like that. This happens through experimentation and just trying things out. And that's how you really get to getting something that's original and emotional all at the same time. Right, so with that being said, let's just quickly play what we got so far. So this one's quite simple. I'm going to duplicate both of these notes up. One thing about this chord progression that I found when I was listening to it, and I had this so far and I hadn't worked on the last chord yet, and I just needed to change the feel of this last chord. So let me just quickly play it so you can sort of grasp an understanding of where we are, and then I'll show you what I did to sort of overcome this last chord not sounding quite right. It's not terrible. It would kind of work perhaps, but it just, for me, it doesn't quite. So it ends on a bit of a downer, really, and that is a minor chord. And just by the way, to tell if a chord is a major or minor chord is very simple to do in your DAW. Just zoom in a little bit. So when you look at the chord, if you've got a gap of 2 notes between the bottom and middle notes, and if you've got a gap of 1, 2, 3, before the middle and top notes, then you've got a minor chord. If it's the other way around and you've got a gap of 3 between the bottom and middle and a gap of 2 between the middle and top, then it's a major chord. It's as simple as that. Now all of the chords in the progression will be either major or minor. Just because you're using a minor scale doesn't mean that they'll all be minor triads. Some of them will be majors. It's just the way it works. So I'll just put that back to where it was for a second. There is also one other type of chord called a diminished chord, which has a gap of 2 between both the bottom and middle and the middle and top. So for example, it would look like that. There's always one diminished chord in sort of, well, almost all scales, major and minor scales. In the minor scale, the diminished chord is always the 2 chord. And you'll notice, or you might have noticed so far, that we're not actually using a 2 chord in this particular chord progression. The diminished chord is kind of harder to get to fit in with your track. Doesn't mean it can't be used. It does get used, but in this track we're not using it, so I'm not going to go into any more detail about it. But the reason I'm explaining all of this is because what we're going to do is we're going to change this last chord from what is it's naturally supposed to be a minor chord, and we're going to do what's called borrowing a chord, and that is simply changing the chord from a minor chord to a major chord. Now I'm just going to play that so you can get a feel for what that sounds like. So it has a sort of happier ending to the chord progression. And the reason it's called a borrowed chord is because, as you might notice, the A note, that isn't actually in this scale. So we're using a note that's outside of the scale that would be in the C major scale, whereas we're using the C minor scale. Now, it doesn't really matter. You don't really need to understand the sort of mechanics or the music theory behind it. Just that you can use what's called a borrowed chord to sort of just change the odd chord here or there. Anyway, let's get on. We've got a couple more things to do to this last chord. So I'm going to duplicate this F up an octave. And I'm actually going to take that A, which is our sort of the borrowed part of the chord, and we're going to move that up a whole octave as well. There is one last thing that I want to do to this, which I need to explain, which is using a sus chord. But first of all, let me just play this so you get an idea of where we are before we add the sus chord. So at the moment, I feel like it just doesn't quite resolve properly. I just want to add one last thing to this. Now, very quickly, before we go any further, I'm actually just going to undo the changes in position here, just so we go back to our original sort of triad, even though it's got the borrowed chord in it, it's still got the A, so this is a major chord rather than a minor chord. And for the first half of it, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to shorten that one, and then I'm going to add in a B flat, which will be known as a sus 4 chord. So we're basically changing the middle note, so we've got no middle note in here, which is normally a natural third, and we're basically moving that up. If we moved it down, that would be a sus 2 chord, that would be a sus 4 chord. If I moved it above, like we sort of discussed, that would be a sus 7 chord. It gets a little bit confusing, but hey, it doesn't really matter, that's fine. This is a sus 2 chord, and that's what we're going to do. So now that I've got those in there, I'm going to move them into their correct position, which is an octave up, and I'm going to duplicate that F again. So I just want to show you like how this was built so you can hopefully understand what's going on there. Now, let me play this. Couple of things I want to do though, and that is I want to change the velocity of a couple of these notes because they have a bit too much emphasis, so I would lower the velocity of these so they're a little bit softer. And then actually just make these almost full whack. Okay, so you might be able to tell that there is a bit of a pattern emerging here. Let's just give ourselves a bit more space so we can see the entire 8-bar chord progression as it stands. So what we've done is we've got simple voicing changes for the first 3 chords in sort of each half of this 8-bar chord progression. And then the 4th chords, or the 4th and the 8th chord, we've done something a bit different. So in the first one, we used a 7th chord, and in the second one, we used, well, 2 things actually, a sus 2 chord and a borrowed chord. And possibly just my opinion, but I would say that, using a 7th chord and a sus 2 chord, a borrowed chord, they're sort of more impactful changes in the chord progression. So it sort of emphasizes the repeating parts before we go back to the 1 chord. We sort of emphasizing this note, then we go back to the 1 chord. We're emphasizing this note, and then we're repeating the chord progression. So that is not to say, of course, that you should not use a 7th chord halfway through the progression or use a borrowed chord for the first chord in your progression. That's absolutely fine. You can do whatever you want. But my point here is, and we'll be talking about this later on in the tutorial, is that this sort of structuring in the sort of way that the chord progression happens, so the first 3 chords just simple voicing, then a bigger change, then another 3 chords, just simple voicing and a bigger change, changes the sort of energetic feel of the melody, and all of this adds to the tension and release of the track. And if you can master that push and pull of tension and release in your songs at all levels, not just the melody level, but also the macro scale, the song structure, then you will be able to make compelling music that people just want to keep listening to. And again, we're going to go into this in much more detail later in the tutorial and really sort of fully analyze this. So what we'll do from here is make this into the full 32 bar chord progression, furthering our understanding of the concept of making complexity out of simplicity. We'll add a top layer to this progression using an adagio string sample. We'll be adding beats, special effects, bass line, much more content, arranging, mixing, all of that good stuff. And of course, explaining it all as we go so you can take the knowledge that you're learning here and use it in your own tracks. So I hope that the first 4 lessons were helpful to you, and I can't wait to show you more in the rest of the course. So go check that out with the link in the description. Thanks for watching, guys and girls. I'll see you in the next one.